Hey guys, in this lesson, I want to talk about ways of managing more complex state. And what do I mean by complex? I mean managing the state of JavaScript objects where you might have to retrieve the previous value of the object. For example, I've added an input to the website and I want to be able to greet the user using both of these pieces of information so that when they type their first name, it says hello and then adds the first name to the H1. And then when they add their last name, the first name is still there and it's still stateful. And the last name also updates and is independent from the first name. Let's think about how we might do this. And I want you to go ahead and fork the starting sandbox. And notice how we've got a very simple form with two inputs and a submit button. I want you to have a think about how you might, using the knowledge that you currently have, achieve this result. Pause the video, give it a go, and then come back and we'll go through it together. And then I'll show you some other ways of doing it too. All right, so I hope you took this opportunity as a little bit of extra practice because this is the only way that you're going to get familiar with it and start turning it into your own muscle memory. The first thing I need is some sort of variable that can hold the value that's being typed into both of these inputs. So I'm going to create a stateful constant, which I'll call fname for first name. And then I'm going to name a method that I'm going to use to set this first name constant. So I'll call it set fname. And then, of course, I have to call the useState method in order to make this constant change and update and be stateful. And remember, this, of course, comes from the React module, so we have to import it too. And then when I call this useState method, I get to provide an initial state. So I'm going to set it to just be an empty string because I'm going to use that as the value of my input. And this is, of course, going to correspond to that constant fname. And I'm also going to add it to the end of my h1. So fname is also going to be used here. And then I'm just going to repeat this process for my last name. So change this to lname, set lname, and the initial state's also going to be an empty string. And then we're going to use that to control this input so that the value matches up with our state. And I'm also going to add it to the end of my h1. So now all I have to do is to call setFname and setLname when they change. So let's go ahead and add the onChange prop to our input, and we're going to make it call a function. And we'll call this update fname and get hold of the event and then call it here. And when this gets triggered, we get past the event, so whatever happened to this input, and we can create a new constant, which is going to be called first name, and we're going to set it to the event.target.value. And then we're going to update our fname constant using the set fname method, and we're going to pass it this new value. So now when I go ahead and write my first name in here, you can see it update. And if I copy this and just update it for my last name, change it in all the places, and also add the onChange to my input. Now you can see that when I type my first name, it adds the first name. When I type my last name, it adds the last name. And that's the solution to the challenge. But you might have noticed through this experience, while it's great practice, it's a little bit painful, right? We have so many functions and we have two separate constants, even though if you think about it, when you create a contact app or when you create some sort of input form, these pieces of information probably should be associated with each other, right? The first name and the last name probably should belong inside the same JavaScript object. So how can we do that? How can we manage a more complex piece of state? Well, we can simply use useState but instead of storing a simple value, we can actually get it to store an object as well. Let's go ahead and delete all of the duplicated bits of code for the last name. And then I'm going to change this constant to just be called full name. And then we're going to change this to set full name. And then we get to specify the initial state. The initial state is going to be an object, and the first key is going to be fname with the value being nothing, an empty string. The second key is going to be the last name with, again, nothing as the value. So now our full name is storing a object. And when we call set full name, ideally we want to set this to a new object. So let's get rid of this function and also update the code in our return statement. So instead of fname, this is going to become full name dot fname. And the same is going to happen with our last name because we're fetching it out of this object now. And then we're going to do the same for our values here as well. And then on the on change, instead of calling two separate methods, I'm going to get it call the same method, which we'll call handle change. And I'm going to call that both here and here. So the idea is that when either of these inputs are changed, they're going to call the same function, passing over the event that calls this change. And then inside this function, we're going to get hold of the new value, which we'll just call new value. And I'm going to set it to event.target.value. But then I want to somehow be able to get hold of the previous value of the full name. So this object essentially, so that I can add to it the parts that have been changed. So if this input changes, then I only want to update the value of the f name. And if this input changes, I only want to update the L name. The other part should stay as it was. So how can we know which input actually triggered the handle change? Well, notice how inside our inputs, we've got the property or attribute called name. And this sets it to a particular value that we can check for when we get hold of the event in our handle change. So I could create a constant called input name and set it to event.target.name. So now if we go ahead and log these things, the new value, and also log our input name. And now if I start typing in my first name, you can see that the input name is logged as fname, which corresponds to the name of the input that triggered the event. And the new value is equal to whatever it is that I typed inside. But if I type something in the last name, notice how the input name changes and it also logs what I typed. But notice how these inputs are not actually showing what I'm typing, even though you can hear that I'm definitely typing in earnest. What's going on here? Well, remember that these are controlled components. So their value, so what they're showing inside here, is set to the full name.fname. And we haven't actually got a way of setting that full name yet. So it's always showing the initial value, which is just the empty string. So while we're testing, I'm just going to go ahead and comment out these two lines so that we turn this into an uncontrolled component. And if you're really curious, you can actually Google for what the difference is with React controlled and uncontrolled components. In this case, in the end, we definitely want a controlled component. We want the value and the state to all be equal to the same thing. But just for now, while we're testing, notice how now I get to actually write stuff, and the thing that I type in here, say Angela, is going to be the final new value once I'm done typing. And the f name corresponds to the input where it came from. So I can use these two pieces of information to create my new object, right? And you might think that it's as simple as saying, well, if the input name is equal to fname, well, in this case, then this new value is going to correspond to what the user typed in here. So in that case, I'm going to call set full name, and inside here, I'm going to pass over the key as fname and the value as the new value. And then else if the input name was equal to lname, well, then that means they must have typed something in here. And in that case, I'm going to set full name to equal to a new object with lname and then the value being the new value. And then we're just missing one equal sign there. So you might think that this would work, but some of you might realize what will happen if I do this. Let's see what happens. If I start typing in the first name field, you can see that this fname is being rendered inside here in our H1. But watch what happens when I start typing in my lname. You can see that it's deleted the previous value of the first name in my object. So what's actually going on here? Well, this is another good opportunity to use the React DevTools. The DevTools inside Code Sandbox does work, but it can take a little while to load and sometimes it doesn't want to. So what I recommend to do instead is to pop it out in a new window and open up your Chrome Developer Tools and then go to the React section. So now if we select the app, you can see in addition to props, we can also see our hooks. And if we expand the state of our object, you can see it starts out with fname equal empty string, lname equal empty string. But when I start typing here, you can see that it's deleted the lname key and value out of this object and it's only kept the fname. And then when I do the same with my last name, you can see it's deleted the first name property and it's only kept the last name. Essentially, what we're doing is each time we're calling set full name, we're replacing this entire object with an object that only has one property, either the fname or the lname. And this is not what we want. What we want to do instead is we want to get hold of the previous value of this full name object and then only add to it the parts which have been changed. In order to do this, instead of just calling set full name or whatever it is that you decided to name the function that's going to update or change this full name, instead of simply just adding the new value inside these parentheses, we can also pass it a function. And I'm going to use a arrow function in this case. And when set full name is called, it can get access to the previous value. And if I simply just log this previous value in here, you'll see what it's actually doing. So whenever I start editing my first name input, it's going to call handle change. It's going to pass the event that led to this change. I'm going to have a new value and I'm going to have an input name. Now, when this happens, I call set full name. And when set full name gets called, I'm passing in a function. That function is going to get hold of the previous value of full name. So as soon as I do this, you can see that it prints an object with fname empty, lname empty. And this is really the key. As we type into our inputs, React will re-render our app component. But our app has state, right, in the form of the full name JavaScript object. And React remembers the value of this object. This means that we can make use of this remembered value as we're updating our first name or our last name. So then the question really becomes, well, how can we use a function that gives a different output depending on the previous value? Well, we could say if the input name, so the name of the input element, was equal to fname, well, in this case, we're going to return a new object where the fname is corresponding to the new value, and then the lname is corresponding to the previous value's LName. And this way, we create a new object and only update the part that has been updated by the user. And we can complete this by adding an else if input name is equal to LName, and make sure that we actually spell this exactly the same as the names in our inputs here. Well, in this case, that means the user must have edited this field, and I'm going to return a different object. The fname in this case is going to be using the previous value's fname, and the LName is going to be using the new value. So now if we go over to our app and I start typing my first name and we look at our app component, you can see this object has its first name property replaced with whatever I typed here. And if I edit my last name, it's now replacing the previous value of last name with my new value, but it's using the previous value for the first name. The last thing to remember to do is just to uncomment these lines so that the values of our inputs can correspond to the latest state, so that we control this input using our state. Now, I've tried to keep this code as expressive as possible so that you can actually see what's going on. But in reality, we'd probably write this code in a much simpler way. To start with, instead of using our constant new value equals event.target.value, input name being event.target.name, we could in fact use our object destructuring. So we could create a new constant, open up a set of curly braces to create a new object literal where we tap into the value property and the name property and we set it to equal event.target. And this will replace both of these things, and we now get to use name, value, and value. And that makes it already a lot simpler looking, right? Now, just as a word of warning, make sure that in the future, when you're creating your own apps or in any of the exercises or challenges, don't try to access the event or anything related to the event inside a stateful setter. So when we set full name, we're trying to update the state of this constant full name. And inside here, if you try to access event, let's say instead of getting the name, we actually try to get event.target.name, even though this seems like valid code, what's actually going to happen is you're going to get an error inside the console, and it's going to warn you about synthetic events being reused. Now, if you're curious, I recommend heading over to the React docs and having a read about these synthetic events. But essentially, what it boils down to is the fact that when these inputs are passing an event through these event listeners, the event that you actually get hold of is not a real event. It's a synthetic event that React has created. And you must never try to access those events when you're trying to use one of these stateful setters. So inside here, you should not ever use event. You should always have it outside, somewhere over here, for example. And I recommend just getting used to using destructuring like this when you're trying to access the new value or the name of the input. Now, we've covered quite a lot of things in this one lesson, and there's a lot of complex topics being thrown around here. So if it's at all confusing, I really recommend to just delete everything, go back to the starting version of the sandbox, and try to see if you can get this behavior created by yourself. That way, you might encounter some problems and you might have to debug some issues, but at least you'll be able to make this knowledge your own. Now, in the next lesson, I've got a challenge for you. So once you're ready and you're happy that you understand what's going on in this lesson, then head over there and complete the challenge.